Okay, so the last session we saw making our web service connect to a database. Now this course uses Spring Data JPA to perform CRUD operations on a table in a database. So let's see what Spring Data JPA is and what the other ways of doing CRUD operations. Spring Data JPA is a DAO technique, and prior to this it was using Hibernate and standard JPA. So before Spring Data JPA we were using Hibernate and standard JPA. Hibernate I think is introduced in the year 2000. From there onwards we have been using Hibernate to perform CRUD operations. Earlier it was JDBC. But usage of Hibernate or these traditional DAO techniques like Hibernate or JDBC, it makes code to be repeated or consists lot of boilerplate code. So repetition is there whenever we use JDBC or Hibernate. Spring Data JPA takes the responsibility of this repetition task and provides all the basic CRUD operations. So with the introduction of Spring Data JPA, this repetition or boilerplate code what we used to write with Hibernate is all gone. With just one function, you'll see how easy it will be if you use Spring Data JPA. When you use Spring Data JPA as a DAO technique, all it needs is a DAO along with an entity type and primary key. So this is the information that you need to give. Entity type is the table what we create in as a Java class, and a primary key. So, and these are the interfaces that we need to utilize if we are working with Spring Data JPA. To start with Spring Data JPA programming model, an interface called JPA repository needs to be extended. Okay, so this repository is what we need to extend. This interface provides the most used CRUD methods and all other methods that come from its parent interfaces like paging and sorting repository and CRUD repository. So you get all such methods: find all, find by ID, delete all, delete by ID, save, etc. So when you use these methods or the Spring Data JPA converts this method into a query. So when I say find by ID, it is nothing but select star from table name where ID equal to the one that you pass. So usage of these methods converts into query. Actually, this is what happens behind the scene. When JPA repository is extended, there won't be a need to write implementation class. And if you see all this in Google, like if you go search for JPA repository, you can see the complete picture. JPA repository. So looking for a proper, yes. So if you can see this interface repository, and from there we get CRUD repository, paging and sorting repository, and finally JPA repository. So this is what we are going to extend, and you can call it as Spring Data JPA, and the other three repositories or the interfaces, if you extend, they come into Spring Data Commons. But because we are very much concerned about Spring Data JPA, we are going to extend this repository, JPA repository. Okay, when JPA repository is extended, there won't be a need to write implementation class. So this is what we need to do in practical. Public interface entity name repository, or the name of your entity or the table, extends JPA repository, and you need to give the table name and the primary key. Like if this is our table, our primary key would be ID and the table name would be to-dos. When you create a class with name to-dos, you call that as an entity, and that's what you need to mention over here. Public interface to-dos repository extends JPA repository. So this is our repository. This layer will create. We'll see using these two lines of code in practical. The above one line of code will provide all the CRUD methods that can be used to perform CRUD operations on the entity, like employee is what I've mentioned, to-dos entity or the table. So the code has reduced in a great extent if you are using Spring Data JPA. So we'll see writing or creating a model first of all as per the table we have. So let's start our project or the web service by creating an entity. For that we need to create similar package. So right click on it and create a new package and give the entire path, which com.code365.services.todos. We say model or model some, and then you finish it and create a class. So new class, and then make sure you give the same name as what you have the table to-dos. So you say to-dos.java. So this is our class, and because we are making this Java class very much or relate to this table, we use entity. We annotate this class by name by entity, and let's import it. And here if you see, you get two sources to import entity. Now we can select both JavaX, or you can select Hibernate, but the difference between these two is Hibernate is like the provider to the specification given by JPA. JPA is the standard from Java or Oracle, and Hibernate is a provider to that specification. And if you depend on the provider completely, like tomorrow if you want to change your project to some other provider, then you have to remove all these entities. So that's the reason we select JavaX persistence, which is from JPA. Now if you select this, you can use the same project working with some other provider like Eclipse Link or any other similar provider that we have as Hibernate. So that's the reason you should select JavaX persistence. So you make the class as an entity, and then you start with the properties or the column names as a variables here. So we say private long ID and private string username and private string description, private string target date, and then private boolean is done. So if you say ID, description is done, target date, username. So these are the 5 fields we have in our table, and I'm creating those same fields over here, and we generate the getters and setters. So you come to source and generate getters and setters. So we select all and we create getter and setter. Okay, so next one would be to create a constructor. So we say public to-dos, and because it's a 0 parameterized constructor, we open and close it, and then similar to this we create a public parameterized constructor to-dos, and in to-dos we give all the this is the parameterized constructor, so string username and string description, string target date and boolean is done. And in here we say we call the super constructor, and then we say this dot id equal to id. So likewise we assign all the values to the class data. This dot, you say username equal to username, and you say this dot description equal to description, this dot target date equal to target date, and finally this dot is done equal to is done. Okay, so this way we have created an entity now. So an entity is done. Now we'll start creating controller, or we have a controller now. We'll receive the request and then we'll pass it to database, but we need some more layers to be created. So the model is done, and we will be modifying our to-do controller so that it can communicate with the database. But before we go with that, let's create one more layer and name it as exceptions. So it's com.code365.services.todos.exceptions, and we need some classes. Like the first class I create is a class to-do exception, to-do-exceptions.java. This is the class I create, and we have certain annotations like response status. So the name says the response that I can send. Okay, and response status, and we send the status as http status dot not found, or we can see like what else we can suits over here, and we go for a constructor public to do exceptions, and then we receive a message, and we simply pass it to its base class, and we do extends it from runtime exception, and you call super and pass the message. Okay, so this is one class. Likewise, I need to create one more class. What response will I be sending? The message, or the format of the message, the format of giving the error to the user. For that I say exception response, and these are the following fields I'll be sending to the client to understand what mistake has happened. So I say private date, timestamp, and private string message, and private string details. So these are some details that I need, or I'll be sending it to the client. Util, and of course what else do I need? I need a constructor. So I say public exception response, and pass in date, timestamp, string message, string details, and here I can say super and I say this dot timestamp equal to timestamp, this dot message equal to message, and this dot details equal to details. And I simply use the get methods. So I right click and say source and create, select getters and setters, and I need only get. Okay, I can select getters also, so I just create getters. Okay, so this is the response I'll be sending. And finally, one more class is what I need, and I name this as customized response entity exception.java, and this class will extend response entity exception handler. So you import it. So this is something coming from Spring. So because we need to make use of Spring's exception handling, I'm importing this class, and I say public final response entity of type is a generic, so I give object directly, and I say handle all exceptions, and the arguments I pass are exception ex web request. Let's import this response entity from Spring framework, and I need an object to be created by Spring, so I say exception handler. I simply say exception dot class. Okay, and here I say exception response. I create an object exception response equal to new exception response is what I created as an object, and the arguments that I pass in are new date and the exception dot get message. So I get the message, and this, let's import. I think it's not SQL, should be Java util. And one more is what I need to pass. The third would be request dot get description, and we'll pass false. Okay, so this the object that we create, and we return new response entity exception response and http status dot internal server error. Okay, and finally we create public final, the return type again response entity generic type object, and I say handle to do exceptions, and the argument I say is to do exceptions ex comma web request and we say exception response, an object again, response equal to exception response, and we pass the same new date ex dot get message, and then request dot get description false, and finally you return new response entity exception response comma status dot not found. So these are the classes that we need to handle any exceptions that occur in our web service.